In 1856, a reporter for the New York Times visited Castle Garden, which was a precursor to Ellis Island in New York, to survey for his readers a shipload of Mormon immigrants from Liverpool. The reporter counted 454 Mormons who had recently arrived on the packet ship Caravan. As he described it, they came from England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and Denmark. But then noted that to the credit of Denmark, there were only 2 Danish families amongst them, and to the credit of Ireland, there was only 1 Irishman. Even though the Mormon immigrants originated in desirable parts of Europe, they were not deemed desirable. As the Times put it, our reporter saw these people, conversed with them, and estimated them intellectually and otherwise. They all belonged to the lower, almost to the lowest classes of society. A typical Welsh peasant is notably clean, the Times declared, whereas the Mormon Welsh peasants were dirty. Typical Welsh girls were distinguished by their very ruddy complexions, very wholesome appearance, and very staid and chaste manners. In contrast, the Welsh girls who had converted to Mormonism were neither ruddy, wholesome, nor staid. Some of them, the Times predicted, will perhaps be added to Brigham Young's harem within a few months. The English and Scotch Mormons were no different. Their countenances were embruted with ignorance and dirt, not the material dirt of a sea voyage, but the moral dirt of a life of imbecility and indolence. In total, the Times declared that among the whole 450, there was scarcely one face that showed that its possessor was greatly elevated above the animal. All of this left the Times to predict that if Salt Lake City is wholly peopled by individuals of the average intellect possessed by the newly arrived immigrants, we should, following the law of depreciation, expect that in a century it would be merely a congregation of apes with tails. The more that I have studied Mormon racial history, the more that I have come to believe that as a predominantly white church in the United States, Mormons have yet to grapple with the power of whiteness in American history and in Mormon history. In 19th century America, whiteness dominated the social, political, and economic life of the country. Politicians equated being white with citizenship and fitness for self-rule. Whiteness was a socially imagined category which was taken for granted, deemed normal or natural, and functioned as the preferred condition in American history. In 1790, Congress established the conditions whereby immigrants could obtain citizenship. It specified that a person had to be free and white. In essence, when Congress passed this law, it gave rise to a perception that persists to the present, that white people belong here, that they have always been here, that they have no immigrant history of their own, and that immigrants are only people who are not white. As a result, sometimes white Mormons like me, assume that immigrant assimilation is what other people had to go through, but certainly not our blonde-haired and blue-eyed ancestors. White Mormons like me sometimes think that race is somehow invisible for white people, and therefore America's racial problems do not impact or affect white people. So how do we overcome these perceptions? What I think has been missing from the dialogue around diversity and Mormonism is whiteness. I think that the Mormon racial story is best understood when we don't take Mormon whiteness as an assumed fact in the 19th century, but understand it as a contested variable. Mormonism was born into an era of fracturing monolithic whiteness in U.S. history, and Mormonism did not escape its consequences. In short, Mormons went from being perceived as not white enough in the 19th century to too white by the 21st century. So successful were Mormons at claiming whiteness for themselves that by the 21st century, Mormons face the exact opposite racial perception, that they are too white. In response, we see an effort on the part of the institutional church to claim an international and racially and ethnic diverse identity for Mormonism. The I'm a Mormon media campaign is probably the most easily recognizable evidence of this. At this moment of heightened rhetoric and deep national concern over immigration, I thought it might be useful to illustrate the ways in which Mormonism's immigration history intersected with its racial history to call Mormon whiteness into question, much like the New York Times reporter in 1856 surveying the faces of Mormon immigrants. If white Mormons in the 21st century can arrive at a more complex understanding of their own ancestors' troubled immigration history, even if their ancestors had blonde hair and blue eyes, it may provide an impetus for empathy in the 21st century. So I decided I would just focus in on Scandinavian immigrants to Utah in the 19th century. So if we look at the 1870 census, it demonstrates that foreign-born immigrants comprise 35% of the Utah population. Of that 35%, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway comprise the largest non-English speaking groups, so the Scandinavian immigrants. And I'm drawing on an article published in the Utah Historical Quarterly by Lynn Hendrickson, George Bailey, Timothy Wright, John Brumbaugh, Jacob Huckabee, and Ray LeBaron for some of the evidence here. It's a wonderful article. I recommend it. They talk through the process of language assimilation for these Scandinavian immigrants. So there was an ideal centered around helping to facilitate language assimilation. Mormon missionaries in the 19th century offered English classes in the countries of origin, and then there were also English classes available in Utah. However, there were also efforts at simply helping to preserve and facilitate language retention and the culture of the people from the countries of origin where they came. So one Scandinavian newspaper announced, "We are not ashamed of the language of the North." And one Scandinavian convert, CCA Christensen, had only scorn for those immigrants who hid all Old World books and bric-a-brac and tried to conceal their foreignness. And the institutional church itself went to efforts to try to help these Scandinavian immigrants in terms of providing language worship services, also efforts at preserving their cultural identities as they immigrate to Utah. Hans Dinesen of Spring City recorded in his journal on December 16th, 1853, that Mormon apostle Rastus Snow came to Spring City and had instructions from President Young to organize Scandinavian meetings. He said, "This should last as long as the Scandinavian immigration should continue." By 1903, Scandinavian language meetings were held in 33 towns. In many places, these Scandinavian language meetings persisted through the 1930s and 40s, well into the 20th century. There were also cultural groups that organized to facilitate the celebration of the culture from the home country. They celebrated Scandinavian holidays and Utah holidays with fellow Scandinavians. For example, the Pleasant Grove Scandinavian organization held a winter sleigh riding party, put on a Christmas Day program, celebrated Swedish Midsummer's Fest, and commemorated Pioneer Day. Other holidays commemorated: Norwegian Constitution Day, Decoration Day, Brigham Young's birthday, Danish Constitution Day, the anniversary of the founding of the Scandinavian Mormon Mission, and U.S. Independence Day. Obviously blending cultural celebrations from the mother country with cultural celebrations from their adoptive country. And businesses also responded to these immigrants as well. You wanted to attract them as customers. So stores employed Scandinavian speakers to welcome these customers in. The Mount Pleasant ZCMI hired 2 clerks, one who spoke English, the other who spoke Danish. Some stores advertised that Scandinavian languages are spoken here. We would love your business. A variety of businesses in Utah took out ads in Scandinavian language newspapers. Dentists, shoe stores, morticians, UP&L, Utah Power and Light, all took out ads in Scandinavian language newspapers. And there were a total of 9 different Scandinavian periodicals published in Utah between 1873 and 1935. What I'm trying to demonstrate is that even if your ancestors had blonde hair and blue eyes, they went through the same 3-generation language assimilation process that all immigrant groups go through. The first generation tends to speak the language of the mother country. The second generation tends to be bilingual. The kids of that generation tends to speak the language of the mother country in the home, and then out in society, the language of the adopted country. And then by the 3rd generation, they are speaking English in this case. And the Scandinavian immigrants go through that same process, and the institutional church provided avenues of worship service and a variety of other ways to help them facilitate language retention as that process played out. And they also go through the same immigrant backlash that we see happening with all waves of immigration to the United States, and we're living through a current immigration backlash presently. If you were blonde hair and blue eyes and a Mormon convert, you also went through an immigrant backlash. I'll just demonstrate some evidence about that. 1879, the U.S. Secretary of State, William Evarts, actually issued a circular to all European consuls asking them to prevent Mormon converts from immigrating to the United States. He described Mormon converts as potential lawbreakers. They would immigrate to the United States, enter plural marriages, polygamy had been declared against the law, and would become future lawbreakers. And he described them immigrating to the United States and joining the law-defying Mormons of Utah, and asked foreign consuls to prevent them from immigrating. The result was that a variety of missionaries were expelled from some European countries, some missionaries thrown into jail, and it hampered Mormon proselyting efforts throughout Europe. And it also led to some of the inspections that took place once Mormon immigrants arrived in New York, like the opening I described from the New York Times. Other results, the Edmunds-Tucker Act annulled the Perpetual Immigrating Fund Company in 1887, also a part of this effort at stemming the tide of Mormon immigrants arriving in the U.S. And March 3rd, 1891, the Immigration Act added polygamists to the federal list of classes excluded from immigration, still on the law books, immigration law books in the U.S., dating back to this effort at stopping Mormons from immigrating. And then Mormon immigrants also became popular fodder in the national press, defining them as immigrant, undesirable, and lawbreakers. This one, published in Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper in 1883, simply titled "The Twin Relics of Barbarism, the Wolves and the Lambs, Arrival of Scandinavian Converts in Charge of Mormon Missionaries at Castle Garden en route for Salt Lake City." And you have the lecherous and lascivious patriarchs who are the wolves waiting to sexually devour the innocent lambs as they arrive as converts from Europe. All of the political cartoons, and I'm just giving you a sampling of them, that target Mormon immigration in the 19th century, imagine that the only gender that are converting to Mormonism are women. The men are the lecherous patriarchs, the women are converting as unsuspecting women who will be funneled into a system of white slavery once they arrive in Utah. This one is in Frank Leslie's 1882, titled "Mormonism in Utah, the Cave of Despair." And once again, you have only women who are converting to Mormonism. They are being welcomed by the lecherous patriarchs, who are also violent. You see the Mountain Meadows Massacre and the bones strewn across the field in the background. So Mormonism is violent and oppressive, and the women are all marked with the label of sealed. And then, to emphasize once again their foreignness, some of the bags are tagged with the countries of origin, Norway, England, and some of them are wearing Dutch wooden shoes, emphasizing their foreignness. They're also labeled with the tag of sealed, already sealed to the waiting lecherous patriarchs, but I think also the intent is their fate is sealed, being welcomed into the Cave of Despair. This one from the WASP, simply titled "Mormon Fishing in Foreign Lands," published in November of 1886. The WASP in this picture featured a Mormon patriarch flying over Europe, riding upon the back of an eagle as he snared a harvest of female converts from across the continent. Women from Russia, Italy, Spain, France, Holland, Austria, Switzerland, Sweden, and Turkey were all lured in by his bait. The ratio of women to men in the illustration was 36-1. A visual depiction meant to heighten alarm over Mormon polygamy, and in this case, to emphasize the decidedly foreign nature of the women swept up in its snare. There was a 2-page illustration published in the WASP the following year that emphasized a similar point, but this time situated Mormon immigrants alongside a variety of other undesirable groups and lamented the fact that America had become the world's dumping ground. In this picture, Uncle Sam stands aghast as he witnesses Irish paupers, French criminals, Spanish paupers, Italian immigration, Russian immigration, Chinese slave importation, German paupers, and in the middle of it all, Mormon proselytes being dumped into a filthy cesspool of cheap labor. The snake of socialism slithers through the pool while the ugly faces of anarchism and demagogism look on. Republican and Democratic Party leaders, rather than attempting to thwart the dumping of such filth, wallow in it, a fact which prompted Uncle Sam to complain that neither party prevents the influx of undesirables, but both seek to profit from this garbage. Interestingly, of all of the groups depicted, the Mormon proselytes were the only people who did not derive their identity from a foreign nation state. It was a construction that placed Mormons alongside paupers and other undesirable immigrants as one facet of the nation's immigration and cheap labor problem, but it did so with a twist. Mormons were religious adherents from a church headquartered in the United States, a community of believers who apparently warranted their own separate identity juxtaposed against the various nation-based immigrants. In this construction, Mormon foreignness was essentialized, a depiction that turned Mormons into an alien group on par with Irish, Italian, French, Spanish, Russian, Chinese, and German immigrants, all contributors to the nation's slithering socialist menace. Mormonism was not merely a religious threat, but a racialized immigrant threat, foreign and dangerous at its core. So what does this mean in terms of the anti-immigrant backlash dominating national politics today? What does it mean for Mormonism's efforts to claim a racially diverse and international identity for itself in the 21st century? I'm not sure that Mormonism will be successful at claiming that more diverse identity, at least in the US, until it learns the lessons of whiteness and starts to teach a racial history that includes those lessons. Especially at this moment of deep racial tension in the United States, how can predominantly white saints in a predominantly white church in the US start seeing Latter-day Saints of color and start recognizing that they may experience Mormonism differently than white Mormons? As long as white Mormons are secure in their whiteness and believe that race is invisible for white people, Mormons will continue to struggle with race and continue to be a predominantly white church in the US. One avenue of hope may come in simply learning a more complex version of Mormon racial history, which includes the lessons of whiteness. White Mormons in the pew will have to become cognizant of their ancestors' own fraught relationships with whiteness. White Mormons might need to learn that their own white ancestors' racial identities were contested, even if those ancestors immigrated from Western and Northern Europe. White Mormons might need to develop a more complex understanding of their ancestors' language and cultural assimilation processes, and understand that simply because their ancestors had blonde hair and blue eyes, it did not mean that they were deemed American on arrival. Most importantly, white Mormons could profitably take the heightened understanding that comes from this more complex version of Mormon racial history and use it as a source of empathy toward marginalized groups in the present. I am willing to concede that this may be wishful thinking, but I'm not willing to concede that it is useless to try. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions. We would ask that you raise your hand and wait for the microphone to arrive so that we can capture your question in our video. And also we ask you to please state your question succinctly and surrender the microphone once you're done, if you could. So, questions?
Something I noticed in both of your presentations was talking about how we need to change our narratives and the stories that we tell about our past. And so as individuals, how can we help change that culture? Like, what conversations can we have to help influence others to have the same understanding and to see things with different eyes. And that could be for either of you.
Pull this a little closer.
Yes,
okay. I think it's first having an honest conversation with ourselves and what this racial history really meant in terms of whiteness, of blackness, and what it means moving forward. And I think when we're able to be honest with ourselves, we can be honest with other people and feel comfortable having these conversations, because it's something it can be difficult to talk about racism. I get it. You know, nobody wants to, call it the R word, you know. But I mean, it's necessary. And so that's.
I would just add, you know, educating ourselves, like learning a more complex history for ourselves, so that we have a firm basis from which we can then start to teach others, or at least be advocates when the situations arise. I hope that the institutional church will also create a more complex narrative that will allow this to take place. It's starting to happen, you know, but I think it takes a long time, and most Latter-day Saints, have to admit, get their version of LDS history from Sunday school. And until the Sunday school narrative changes, I'm not sure we're going to make a lot of headway. And that has to begin with the manuals that a teacher is given, right? Garbage in, garbage out. And so until those manuals are improved, at the Sunday school level at least, I'm leery that there's going to be a dramatic change. But institutes and seminaries are making changes in their curriculums that I think are moving us in the right direction, and we're hopefully going to have the next generation raised on a different narrative.
Hi, this question is directed at Mrs. Graham Russell. We are in a civil rights seminar at BYU, and this week we have been studying about the strength and resilience of early African saints. And so I'm wondering, as a Black Mormon, where does the source of your strength come from when you see pictures in the temple that don't represent people that look like you, or predominantly white leadership in the church? Where does your source of strength come from?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking. So I converted to the church about 7 years ago, and I was raised in a Christian household, and I always was taught about the intimate relationship between myself and God. And I know for myself that Black people were never cursed. It's not just on a social level, but reading the scriptures, actually reading what it says in the curse of Cain, that it's not the curse of black skin. And so I find my strength through Christ. And like I mentioned before, that hope. There's a book called The Prophetic Imagination. I'm trying to think of the author's name, but he talks about this alternative vision that the Israelites had for themselves, and that was provided by Moses, or God through Moses. And so I try to apply that to my own faith and to my own religious practice, is that to have an alternative vision of not only myself, but also other Black saints. And that the curse is not the end of the narrative.
I just wanted to thank you so much, Janan. Your words are like general conference for me. I've been, as these girls know, this has been an issue that I've struggled with. I've thought about a lot, being Black and Mormon, and having to decide whether I choose my identity and Blackness over my exaltation and covenants. And it's hard. It's so hard. But my question would be, how do you explain to church members the need for social and political activism, and this is for both of you, when the church teaches that you're supposed to be in the world but not of the world, and that you should have an eternal perspective? Because I can't be black and not fight for justice. That seems like such a contradiction to me, but I feel like it's such a contradiction within the church also.
I'd say that I feel you on all points. And it's interesting because as African Americans, as Black people, there's this understanding. I don't know what your faith background is, if you've always been a member of the church. There's this understanding that the physical body and the spiritual body are one. And so if you're not talking about what's happening to you physically, whether it's racism, I mean, we talk about police violence, but there's other types of state-sanctioned violence that happen to Black bodies each and every day. And if you're not talking about what's going on to Black bodies, then it's going to affect you spiritually. And so I get that when you're sitting in church and you're like, what? Why are they not talking about this? And I think one way to approach it is looking at racism and white supremacy as sin. We look at sin as something that keeps people from reaching their highest human potential. And if we are able to approach white supremacy and racism in that manner, I think that is a better way to, not a better way, it is a way to approach these conversations within the church where it might seem uncomfortable.
So on the point about activism, I think that's another point wherein we kind of don't tell our 19th century story all that well. Mormons in the 19th century were profoundly involved in civil disobedience. Polygamy was outlawed in 1862. If we were following the laws of the land, we would have abandoned polygamy in 1862. And then when the Supreme Court handed down its decision, explicitly, the church went into an era of civil disobedience. And you have wonderful speeches from Mormon women across the course of the 19th century who are standing up and very active. We can draw upon that as a part of our heritage. So certainly there is, honoring and obeying and sustaining the law of the land. But John Taylor, after the Supreme Court decided, he said, when the laws of the land come into conflict with the laws of God, I'll go with the laws of God. And ushered in an era of civil disobedience. He dies on the Mormon underground, hiding from federal officials. So we have examples that when injustice is, perceived even by our leadership of standing up. I think there are things that we can do. I don't feel like, speaking out is somehow not being a good Mormon. I think, in fact, it is being a good Mormon. I've written 2 op-eds for the Deseret News specifically for that audience because I feel like that's the audience that needs maybe to listen to a more complex version of things. One defending Black Lives Matter, and one speaking out against Trump's Muslim ban. I think we can have a voice, and the Deseret News readily published both of those. So I think there is a way that we can participate and we can speak up, and I think we have a heritage of doing so as Latter-day Saints.
I have time for one more question.
Well, I'm sorry, first of all, that I seem to be the one just squeezed in. I came in a little late, and so I missed your presentation, Janae, and I apologize for that. Just your comments make it sound wonderful. And Paul, I appreciate you talking about the Scandinavians and the kind of internal complexity within Mormonism, and also how they, as the focal point of Mormon immigration, became stigmatized by the United States. I think it's an often forgotten story. You may have spoken about this since I came in late, but it strikes me that there are other stories here that are also very important. Of course, you can never talk about everything. But if you could maybe either tell me you already said this or explain a bit more about it. One thing that intrigues me is that in the 19th century, when Mormonism expanded into Mexico, in the first expedition, they rejected a community of mostly indigenous, native Indian Mexicans who were very desiring to join the church. And historians such as Lamont Tullis make a fairly big deal about this. but it's rather stunning in a way, because the main issue was one of Anglo settlement of northern Mexico and finding adequate places for these polygamists you mentioned. And then there's also the issue of the white racism that would typified the Anglo colonies in Mexico, racism against indigenous Mexicans and mestizo Mexicans. Other than Ray Pratt, it seems like the Anglo leadership was extremely, extremely ambivalent about the native Mexicans of the Valley of the Volcanoes, as it's called, around Atlautla and Osumba, who joined the church, and are to this day extremely strong members, and some of them were founders of the Salt Lake Hispanic community. But it's not just that, it's also Hawaiians, people from Tahiti, who joined the church very quickly en masse. There was a settlement in Yosepa, and one of the key things here is the absolute rejection, well, not absolute, but the rejection of these people as whites, and the marginalization of them, and a really serious questioning of them as legitimate members on some levels. At the same time, they're accepted. And another thing that strikes me is the real difficulty of African American members, either slaves who came with the early Mormons because Mormons were slave-keeping people, or those who had joined the church were free people of color and settled in Utah. For example, Mill Creek in Salt Lake Valley was an originally black settlement. And so it strikes me there's a real complex story here, not just of Scandinavians, but also a very strong internal racial barrier that was one against indigenous Mexicans, while perhaps accepting of indigenous Hopis. That was one of rejection against indigenous Polynesians who joined the church, and certainly one of rejection of African American Latter-day Saints. And all three peoples, I will note, are people even today of extremely strong faith. I don't know if maybe you could comment on that. And Janae, you may have some words too. I realize it's a historical question. And again, I apologize for squeezing it at the end.
Yeah, no, I completely agreed, David. And I focused on Scandinavian immigrants because my perception of the current political climate tends to be that white people ignore their own fraught immigrant history, simply not aware of it, right? And so I'm just trying to provide that sense. And your point about Mormon missionary incursions into Mexico, obviously racializing the people that they encounter in that process. And so there's a very fraught racial hierarchy that's at play in the 19th century. And, I argue in my book that Mormons are, in fact, attempting to claim whiteness for themselves, and it comes at profound costs. And some of that is in distance from blackness, distance from other marginalized groups so that they can arrive at securely white. So that's the complexity that obviously doesn't show up in these remarks, but I concur with the point that you're making, absolutely.
Sadly, we're out of time, but both Janan and Paul will return after our keynote address at 10 o'clock during the 11 o'clock hour for a full panel discussion. So more to come there. In the meantime, please join me in thanking both of our panelists.